The corridors of Caligula's palace were never places where political strategy or intellectual debate filled the air. Instead, they pulsed with the muffled pleas of people who suddenly understood that mercy had no place within those marble walls. Under his reign, Rome's highest families discovered a new category of fear, one that forced fathers to weigh their loyalty to the empire against the innocence of their own daughters, and husbands to sit motionless as their wives were degraded before an audience that treated humiliation like entertainment sanctioned by the state. What unfolded inside that palace was not a burst of uncontrollable madness, nor the random cruelty of a man drunk on power, but a carefully engineered system in which violation was routine, documented, and treated as administrative business, with each act assigned a value, a ledger entry, and a prescribed method. Through this machine of orchestrated depravity, the most powerful empire of the ancient world found itself submitting not to chaos, but to a structure built for moral collapse. To understand how Rome reached this point, we must trace the story back to the moment a smiling young heir was embraced as the city's great promise. Before we descend into these horrors, remember to support this channel by liking the video and subscribing so you never miss any of our deeper explorations into history's darkest chapters. Caligula's story did not begin in the shadows that would eventually swallow Rome. It began in the warm glow of adoration, where an empire worn down by years of Tiberius's suffocating paranoia desperately projected its hopes onto a young man they believed would restore dignity, humanity, and joy to their fractured world. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known affectionately as Caligula because of the miniature soldier boots he wore as a child, carried a name that reminded the legions of his father's charisma and the grandeur that Rome believed destiny had reserved for him. When he ascended to the throne, celebrations erupted across the empire for 100 uninterrupted days, as if the entire population collectively exhaled for the first time in decades. Women showered the streets with petals wherever he walked. Children sang melodies praising the arrival of a benevolent ruler. Senators who had spent years trembling before Tiberius's unpredictable wrath suddenly found themselves relaxing, convinced that the age of terror had ended and a new golden era was about to begin. But the optimistic facade that Rome embraced so eagerly was built upon foundations Caligula himself had learned to construct long before the throne was within reach. His childhood had been a strange mixture of adoration and trauma, because while he was cherished by the soldiers who idolized his father Germanicus, he also witnessed the brutal consequences of imperial intrigue. Germanicus's death, surrounded by whispers of poisoning and conspiracy, marked the beginning of a brutal unraveling of Caligula's family. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was banished. His older brothers were executed or driven into exile, and he survived the collapse of his bloodline only by mastering the craft of appearing harmless, foolish, and unthreatening. Life under Tiberius taught him the most important lesson of Roman survival. One must hide the truth of one's mind to protect the truth of one's life. By the time he became emperor, deception was not a tool for Caligula. It was his nature. In the first months of his rule, the mask he wore was flawless. He reduced taxes, freed political prisoners, repaired aqueducts and roads, funded elaborate public festivals, and personally interacted with crowds in a way Rome had not seen in generations. The contrast with Tiberius was so extraordinary that even skeptical senators allowed themselves to believe that the gods had finally intervened on behalf of the empire. Caligula walked through the streets with an approachable grace, smiled with an almost divine charm, and carried himself like the embodiment of Roman ideals. For a brief moment, the empire dared to believe in miracles. Then, in the autumn of 37 CE, everything changed with terrifying suddenness. A violent and mysterious illness struck him down, pushing him to the brink of death. Court physicians wrote of fevers so severe they doubted any mortal could survive them, and delirious convulsions in which Caligula screamed that Jupiter himself was speaking to him through the walls. The palace froze in collective terror. Senators offered sacrifices. Priests staged desperate rituals. Citizens vowed their own lives if it meant saving the emperor, and when Caligula finally opened his eyes, Rome celebrated as if a god had been resurrected. But the man who rose from that sickbed was not the man they had placed onto the throne. Subtle changes became unsettling transformations. The warmth drained from his gaze. replaced by a hollow intensity. His sleepless nights became long, wandering vigils through the palace gardens. Servants found him speaking to statues, whispering threats to unseen enemies, and burying his hands in soil as if planting the empire's destiny himself. And then came the command that shattered all illusions. Every statue of every god in Rome was to have its head removed and replaced with his own likeness. It was not an act of madness. It was the first declaration of a new reality. His descent began at home. Before Rome understood what was happening, the emperor's world collapsed inward around his sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Livilla, women who ceased to be family members and instead became the earliest casualties of a corruption so deep that it would drag the entire empire into a nightmare disguised as divine authority. The transformation that overtook Caligula after his illness did not erupt in an instant of public madness. Rather, it unfolded with the slow, deliberate inevitability of a shadow stretching across the marble floors of the palace, swallowing every last remnant of the hopeful ruler Rome had celebrated. Those who walked the imperial halls during those first weeks sensed something shifting beneath the surface, as if the fever that had nearly claimed his life had burned away the boundaries that once tethered his humanity to reason. The physicians who had stood helpless as he writhed in delirium described nights when he ranted that Jupiter had granted him dominion over not just Rome, but every mortal soul within it. When he recovered, he did not thank the gods, he replaced them. The order he issued to strip every statue in Rome of its divine head and replace it with his own was not simply an act of arrogance. It was the declaration of a man who no longer recognized any authority beyond his own shifting desires. What followed inside the imperial household revealed the first horrifying outlines of the system he would eventually impose upon the entire elite. His relationship with his sisters, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Livia, slid from familial affection into a twisted dynamic that Rome struggled to even name. Drusilla, the sister he adored most, became the central axis of his private world, elevated publicly to a position that resembled that of an empress more than a sibling. Seated beside him at ceremonies where only imperial wives belonged. Courtiers whispered their confusion, but no one dared question the emperor's intentions, because the punishment for misreading his mood was often swift and fatal. When Drusilla died suddenly, the grief that seized him did not resemble mourning. It resembled the rage of a man robbed of ownership, a fury so intense that he imposed a mourning period so suffocating that laughter, routine meals, and even private moments of comfort became crimes punishable by death. The city moved in terrified silence, afraid that any sign of relief would bring immediate execution. Drusilla's death cracked something open within Caligula, and the darkness that seeped through began to reshape the palace into a laboratory of controlled degradation. With his favored sister gone, his attention fractured and redirected itself toward the remaining women of his bloodline. Agrippina and Julia Livilla, once proud daughters of Rome's nobility, found themselves recast as instruments within the emperor's expanding obsessions, the first unwilling participants in practices he justified under the claim of divine authority. But his ambitions quickly outgrew the confines of family, and soon the wives and daughters of Rome's most influential men were being summoned to the palace under the pretense of honor, only to discover that they were stepping into a series of rituals designed to test, measure, and catalog their compliance. Caligula did not operate like a chaotic tyrant acting on impulse. He functioned like a bureaucrat of depravity, recording every humiliation with the precision of an accountant balancing the empire's treasury. He would observe noble women and girls from a gilded platform constructed specifically for his viewing pleasure, taking meticulous notes on their reactions, who trembled, who hesitated, who attempted to appear indifferent. These observations were not idle amusements, but political weapons, used later to coerce senators into obedience or punish them for perceived disloyalty. A senator who appeared too eager to comply found himself trapped in a web of compromising obligations, while one who showed reluctance would return home to discover that his son had been taken, mutilated, or beaten. The message unmistakable: neutrality no longer existed in Rome. The machinery of control grew more sophisticated as Caligula expanded his system. Physicians were ordered to conduct examinations on young women and girls, assessing their fertility and their ability to withstand repeated use. These examinations were performed in full view of the emperor, who interrogated the physicians with an eerie blend of curiosity and political calculation, asking invasive questions as if he were evaluating livestock rather than human beings. Records were kept, categorized, and stored with the same care Rome used for tax documentation or census rolls. Everything, from the physical condition of each victim to the reactions of their families, was logged and reviewed. By the time Rome's elite realized what was happening, it was too late. The palace had become the nucleus of a new political order, one in which families were not merely punished or rewarded. They were broken down, reshaped, and woven into a tapestry of controlled submission. Caligula had discovered a form of power more intoxicating than wealth or military triumph: the ability to force Rome's nobility to participate in their own destruction, and to watch as they justified their compliance to themselves, clinging to dignity that had long since been stripped away. As Caligula's obsessions deepened, what had begun as a series of private violations within the imperial household evolved into an institutional system that reached into every influential family in Rome, reshaping the palace into a mechanism of humiliation engineered with the precision of a military apparatus. The emperor no longer relied on impulsive orders or fleeting whims. He constructed a hierarchy in which every chamber, every ritual, and every participant served a function that reinforced his absolute dominion over the bodies and dignity of Rome's elite. What horrified contemporaries was not merely the scale of the abuses, but the way they were embedded into the administrative spine of the empire, treated as routine operations with established procedures, assigned personnel, designated spaces, and financial regulations that gave these atrocities the appearance of lawful state activity. The palace itself became a labyrinth of renamed rooms, each repurposed to support a different facet of Caligula's perverse theology of power. The so-called Room of Jupiter, decorated with frescoes that portrayed the emperor as a living god descending upon mortals, served as the primary chamber for his ritualized degradations. Here, noblewomen were forced to reenact mythological scenes rewritten to glorify Caligula's divine image, their movements orchestrated according to scripts that mocked the old legends of Rome. Adjacent to it lay the Chamber of Venus, where matrons of distinguished families were compelled into ceremonies designed to parody religious rites, their participation recorded as offerings to the emperor's invented cult. Even a hall associated with Priapus was constructed, its walls adorned with obscene symbols that declared to all who entered that resistance was futile and modesty irrelevant. These were not haphazard settings, but deliberately structured environments in which every detail, from the lighting provided by braziers to the positioning of observers, reinforced the sense that participants were trapped inside a sacred bureaucracy from which there was no escape. The women selected for these roles were never random. They were chosen from Rome's highest-ranking families, ensuring that each violation reverberated far beyond the palace walls and poisoned the honor of entire bloodlines. Senators' wives found themselves drafted into what Caligula cynically referred to as the imperial cult of service, required to follow strict schedules, wear designated garments spun from gossamer thin Syrian silks, and adhere to rituals that transformed noble households into extensions of the emperor's will. Daughters as young as 12 were initiated into these patterns under the pretense of divine instruction, their innocence twisted into another tool of control. Everything that happened to them was documented in ledgers so detailed that they resembled census registers, with entries listing ages, social ranks, physical descriptions, acts performed, medical conditions afterward, physicians present, and fees extracted from families who were forced to pretend these contributions were voluntary. These fees, far from disappearing into private coffers, were incorporated into Rome's financial system as contributions to imperial revenues, legitimizing atrocity by giving it a place within the economic structure of the state. A knight who wished to regain favor could offer payment for the temporary use of his wife. A senator seeking political survival might surrender his daughter under the guise of religious devotion. The rates varied according to social class and perceived purity, with virginal daughters of high-ranking men valued the most. Fathers who protested were not ignored but crushed, often through the calculated targeting of their sons, who were abducted, mutilated, or publicly shamed, ensuring that family loyalty fractured under the unbearable weight of fear. The degradation extended beyond women. Caligula devised an elaborate program of feminization aimed at the sons of patrician houses, dressing boys in delicate saffron robes, painting their faces, and training them to move with gestures he found aesthetically amusing. These boys were paraded before guests at banquets, auctioned for entertainment, and evaluated like chattel. Once they had been transformed into symbols of their family's helplessness, their fathers became irrevocably bound to the emperor's will, unable to resist for fear of what further horrors might be inflicted upon their surviving children. Caligula's genius, if such a word can be applied to cruelty, was his ability to convert personal depravity into a framework that implicated the entire aristocracy. Every act required participants, observers, record-keepers, physicians, guards, accountants, and scribes, each of whom could claim they were merely fulfilling their expected role. No single person stood as the monster. Instead, the monster became the system itself, an intricate lattice of collective complicity. What made this machinery so durable was not simply Caligula's tyranny, but the way it turned the defenders of Roman virtue into silent collaborators. Men who once prided themselves on honor, now reduced to accessories in the emperor's ritualized destruction of their own households. As Caligula's system grew more elaborate, the rituals he orchestrated no longer resembled private perversities confined to the dim corridors of the palace. Instead, they evolved into grand public ceremonies infused with the solemnity of religious festivals and the orchestration of staged dramas, where Rome's most respected families found themselves forced to participate in spectacles that mocked the very foundations of their honor. These events were held on nights chosen for their symbolic potency, particularly during full moons, when the emperor claimed that divine forces strengthened his power and blessed the rites he designed. In the converted amphitheater that once hosted intimate gatherings, Caligula transformed the space into a grotesque temple where noblewomen, conscripted sons, and selected slaves were pitted against gladiators, foreign captives, and even animals imported from distant provinces, creating scenes that blended ritualized humiliation with theatrical savagery. Senators, compelled to attend in their stately togas, sat rigidly in the galleries while their wives and daughters were paraded in the arena below, their attempts to maintain dignity crushed by the knowledge that resistance would only result in deeper suffering for themselves or their children. Caligula presided over these spectacles with a kind of ceremonial ecstasy, wielding a gilded baton adorned with phallic symbols to signal his choices, dictate pairings, and choreograph movements in a manner that suggested he saw himself not only as emperor, but as priest, director, and god. Each detail was recorded by scribes who stood at the edges of the arena with wax tablets, noting the names of participants, the duration of each act, and the degree of visible compliance, transforming human agony into a series of numbered entries. This obsessive documentation gave the rituals a bureaucratic finality, as though the emperor believed that suffering did not exist unless it had been written, categorized, and preserved. The formalization of these events meant that even spectators became participants, because the simple act of watching, performed under threat, bound them to the emperor's will, forcing them to witness the destruction of their own class without uttering a word of protest. The cruelty extended beyond the arena into the deepest fabric of Roman family life. Caligula discovered that the most effective form of domination was not to break individuals, but to compel parents, spouses, and siblings to collaborate in the destruction of their own kin. Fathers were commanded to deliver their wives and daughters to the palace, signing documents that framed the service as voluntary dedication to the emperor's divine cult. Mothers were forced to stand beside their daughters during examinations, offering approval in tones thick with unreleased terror, while siblings were ordered to appear in ceremonies that reversed their familial roles, erasing boundaries that Roman tradition had upheld for centuries. By forcing families to participate in their own unraveling, Caligula broke not only their spirits, but the very social codes that had held Roman aristocracy together. The shame of collaboration was often more unbearable than the violence itself, because once a father had handed over his child or a husband had watched the humiliation of his wife, he could no longer claim innocence. He became part of the machine, a silent cog turning in rhythm with the emperor's insatiable appetite for domination. This strategy reached its most chilling expression in cases like that of Senator Cornelius, whose refusal to surrender his wife before the Senate seemed, for a brief moment, like a spark of defiance that might ignite resistance. Instead, Caligula responded by seizing Cornelius's 8-year-old son, mutilating the boy in ways so grotesque that even hardened guards recoiled, and leaving him alive on the Senate steps with a message carved into his skin that made the choice before Cornelius unmistakable. The senator, shattered by the sight, delivered his wife to the palace the same afternoon, and when she later conceived under the emperor's decree, he was forced to acknowledge the child as legitimate, thereby erasing his own lineage with his own signature. Caligula transformed the horror into law when the Senate, broken by fear, voted unanimously that any child belonging to the emperor, regardless of its origins, would surpass all legitimate heirs of Rome's nobility. From these horrors emerged an entirely new economy within the empire, one fueled by suffering and sustained by those desperate enough to profit from survival. Vendors clustered outside the palace selling ointments and poultices, knowing exactly what wounds they were meant to soothe. Midwives offered secret procedures for women trying to prevent pregnancies forced upon them. Apothecaries created concoctions intended to dull the mind to make obedience easier. Each participant, doctor, scribe, merchant, guard earned coin from the system, and with each transaction the web of complicity grew thicker. Caligula understood that greed was sometimes more effective than fear, because once people earned their living from atrocity, they stopped imagining a world where those atrocities could end. By the time the machinery was fully established, Rome itself had been reshaped into a society where silence was currency, suffering was ritual, and families, broken, shamed, and entangled in the emperor's demands, no longer had the strength to resist. Caligula had not simply crushed his enemies. He had redefined what it meant to be Roman, turning the virtues of loyalty, duty, and obedience into instruments of their own undoing. As Caligula's dominion expanded and the palace transformed into an ever-tightening web of ritualized cruelty, it became clear that the emperor was not merely indulging in personal excess, but engineering a system whose reach extended far beyond the marble walls where the acts occurred. Every violation produced not only a victim but a record. Every humiliation created not only despair but a precedent. Every forced participation left behind scars that would long outlive the man who governed them. The imperial archive, buried beneath the Palatine, grew into a chilling monument to the emperor's ambition, filled with ledgers that catalogued the destruction of Rome's nobility with the same meticulous care that previous emperors had reserved for census data or military victories. The men who maintained these files, scribes, record-keepers, accountants, performed their duties with a mechanical detachment that revealed how deeply the system had infiltrated the conscience of the state. They documented names, ages, social status, physical injuries, forced pregnancies, dates of examinations, medical interventions, schedules of rituals, and the precise amounts paid by fathers and husbands, turning the suffering of thousands into a bureaucratic chronicle so vast that it resembled the administrative machinery of an entire ministry. Over time, participation in this system became so widespread that distinctions between victim and collaborator blurred, because those who might have resisted found themselves ensnared by earlier compromises, trapped by their own signatures, silenced by their own fear. The senators who once debated the fate of nations now debated only how best to protect their families from deeper humiliation, and the Praetorian Guard, originally tasked with protecting the emperor for the sake of the empire, became guardians of his deviant rituals, rewarded with access to victims and elevated ranks that tied them irrevocably to the atrocities they enforced. These soldiers, hardened by campaigns across the empire, found themselves transformed into instruments of intimate violence, patrolling corridors not for enemies of Rome, but for those who dared whisper dissent against the emperor's divine facade. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran mocked so relentlessly by Caligula for his physical limitations and vocal tone that his resentment grew into something far more potent than wounded pride. The cruelty he endured was not grand or ceremonial. It was petty, personal, and relentless, demonstrating that the emperor's appetite for domination extended even to those who enforced his rule. The breaking point arrived in late January of 41 CE, when the emperor staged what he envisioned as a climactic ritual, a final spectacle designed to surpass all previous degradations in scale and symbolism. He arranged an event in which the wives of senators were paired in a grotesque contest against gladiators, slaves, and selected captives, their names and pairings called aloud like livestock in a marketplace. Caligula believed this would cement his legacy as a divine ruler whose power penetrated the deepest sanctums of Roman society, but instead it became the catalyst for his demise. Early the next day, as he walked through an underground passage leading to the theater, Sharia and a small group of conspirators ambushed him, striking with blades fueled by years of humiliation. The emperor, who had spent his reign weaponizing the bodies of others against themselves, met his end with dozens of wounds, including one delivered deliberately to his genitals, a symbolic retaliation for the countless mutilations he had authorized. Caligula's wife and young daughter were killed shortly afterward in an attempt to extinguish the bloodline, but the conspirators soon realized that the destruction of the man did nothing to erase the machinery he had built. For even as Caligula's body was removed and his statues defaced, the records remained, the pregnancies continued, the children born under coerced unions grew into adulthood without understanding their origins, and the women who had been forced into rituals carried their trauma into old age, their faces etched with memories that could not be legislated away. The Senate moved swiftly to enact a damnatio memoriae, hoping to purge Caligula from collective memory by erasing his name from inscriptions and melting down coins that bore his likeness. But these measures did nothing to dissolve the lived experiences of those who had suffered beneath his reign. Fathers who had once lifted torches for the emperor's rituals found themselves unable to look their daughters in the eye. Mothers who had stood silent beside their children during examinations carried an unspoken guilt that would haunt them until death. Sons forced into feminized displays grew into men who bore emotional wounds they could not articulate. Caligula had not only violated individuals, he had ruptured the moral architecture of Rome, and the reverberations of that rupture extended into future generations. The instructions he wrote, the protocols, the procedures, the legal scaffolding, remained in the archives, adaptable and frighteningly usable for any future tyrant who wished to convert personal depravity into statecraft. History remembers Caligula as a madman, but madness alone could not have produced a system so complex and enduring. It required intention, structure, and the silent complicity of those who feared him too deeply to resist. In the end, his death ended his life, but not his legacy, because the institutions he corrupted survived him, a testament to the truth that systems of cruelty often outlive the men who create them. If you found this exploration into one of Rome's darkest chapters powerful and informative, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's most haunting stories.